If you like watercolor, you might also be a little curious about gouache. Now, this is a set of gouache that I bought about 2 years ago, I think. It is a little dry, but it is still wet. And this set of gouache is kind of like a beginner set of gouache. I'm gonna respray mine so that it can be a little more hydrated when I actually use it. Gouache also comes in tubes like this that look just like watercolor tubes, and the paint in it is kind of similar. And it's similar in the way that it's water activated, and then you can also reactivate it with water. But there are two main differences between these two mediums. The first is opacity. Watercolor is a naturally transparent or mostly transparent medium, and that means that you can see the paper behind it when you paint it on. Gouache, on the other hand, is meant to be opaque, meaning that whatever you put it on top of, it's going to cover, or for the most part it will, unless you really water it down. And because of the covering versus transparent property, how we paint with it is going to differ quite a bit. In watercolor, we use the paper to actually be the white, and so we avoid certain areas that we want to be lighter. And you could technically do that with gouache too, but in gouache you can actually work the opposite way, starting with your darker colors, and then you can layer lighter colors like white on top as a finishing touch. So let's paint a simple pumpkin in watercolor and then gouache so we can actually see the differences in action. With watercolor, we want to actually start by loading our brush up with a lot of water. We want this to be a runny consistency. And for this pumpkin, I'm going to start by using a super light yellow wash of color. You could do this with just water, but I want you guys to be able to see where I'm placing this down, and I'm going to make these little segments that don't quite touch each other. Then I'm going to wash my brush and I'm going to tap it into these different colors, and I'm going to actually just let it touch along the sides. And that's going to keep the middle part lighter, meaning that we're going to be able to keep that middle part as our highlight because more of the paper is showing through. I'm also going to just quickly grab some brown or green, and I'm going to make a little stem here. And of course I'm going to add a curly cube for the pumpkin. Now gouache, we are going to start by using a wet brush, but when we grab the colors, we want them to be a little bit thicker. We're going to load up our brush with a decent amount of that color so that it can kind of be smeared across the page instead of just placed in a watery consistency. And then rather than starting with that super light color, I'm actually going to start with more of a deep pumpkin color and make those same types of segments with that darker color. Then I'm going to wash my brush, and the gouache is going to be a little wet still. It's okay because it'll give us a little blending. But then I'm going to grab a lighter color and I'm going to place that avoiding the edges, kind of in the center part. Wash my brush again, and finally grab some bright white, and I'm going to place that right where I want the highlights to be on the pumpkin. And then for the stem on this one, I'm going to load my brush where part of it is going to have some green and part of it's going to have some brown on it, and I'm just going to make a little stem and leave it as it is. Oh yeah, and we can never forget the curly cues. Watercolor is going to have those really magical interactions that you just can't really replicate with many other materials. But gouache can be a lot more forgiving because you can layer lighter colors on top of it, which means you can cover your mistakes in an easier manner. You can also work with gouache a lot thinner if you want to. I know that a lot of gouache artists frown on this, and even some gouache artists might frown on the method that I used here because they like to work in more solid blocks of color. There's a very beautiful art style that's very unique to gouache itself, but I kind of like to work with gouache in a similar manner to how I would use acrylic paint. One of the big differences though is that unlike acrylic paint, because acrylic paint sets and it's permanent how you have it, this one you could actually reactivate with water and reblend things or layer more things on, or even kind of take some of it off if you wanted to. Which means that you can kind of work with it almost like oil paint, because oil paint has such a long drying time, where you can actually go back in and blend things days later if you wanted to. I hope this was helpful in explaining some of the major differences between watercolor and gouache.